Hello, my name is Dan Nolan, and I also did a breakout room in our teaching environments workshop on German ecological thought in the classroom. And this breakout was on academic civic engagement. In our breakout, participants and I worked through some of the local conditions of projects they were entertaining, and we really kind of looked at what a civic engaged learning project could look like for their specific needs. We did that because it was a more interactive and dynamic way to engage with the material. And we can't really do that here in video format. So instead, I'm trying to provide some action steps that instructors can take in perhaps developing their first community engaged learning project in sustainability and German studies. And so I'd like to start off with just some guidelines that I think are reflective not only of my own work, but are a summary of some of the things you'll see at other institutions. I think that there is some consensus, there's growing consensus on some good practices for getting started with civic engagement and community engaged learning. And it's also helpful to focus on these guidelines and getting started because they help us answer this question: why do we see value in community engagement in our work in sustainability in programs like German studies programs? And the reason I think is simply that community engaged work helps us ground the learning that we're doing in sustainability and in international international learning. Oftentimes, whether it's in study abroad or in a virtual exchange or in a German studies classroom, it's easy for our students to and ourselves to operate at a merely superficial level. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, in part because looking at another country's progress and making progress in their sustainable development goals makes it easy to simply see their work as attractive, as something that we could simply adopt. And that it's clear that that's just not the case, in large part because progress in sustainable development is culturally conditioned. And that precisely is what German studies programs have to offer, is that we in German studies are capable of unpacking those cultural conditions. We're capable of looking at the history of things like whether it be recycling programs or food-related programs or water conservancy. The progress that has been made, for instance, in energy transition in some German-speaking countries has been possible because of a long and complex history of smaller steps. And when we're attempting to change our mindsets and not simply the technology that we're applying, then looking at those cultural conditions is critical. And to do that, we really need to ground the learning that our students are doing in these projects. And we can do that with community engagement, which is to say simply that we ask our students and we ask ourselves to look first at that local context. What's being done in your community? What local knowledge do organizations already possess, in order to then ask, first of all, what would the next step be? And if there is the potential to learn something from, say, an international or a German-speaking partner, how can that translation happen? You need to know the local context before you can begin the process of translating results from other cultures. So that's unusually valuable. Also, across the board, folks agree finding well-suited partners for these projects is critical. If the partners you're hoping to work with, say, are so busy and successful that they don't have time for your students, then that might not be a good partner. If the scale of their work is such that your students really won't be able to grasp or engage with enough of their work in the course of a semester or multi-week project, then that might not be a good partner. And that goes to, I'm going to talk in a couple minutes about scales of engagement and scales of projects for community engaged learning. You don't need to do a semester long project. You can do a community engaged worksheet. And you can scale up and down the breadth of your engagement with communities, but whether or not you're doing a larger project, whether or not you're really producing results for community-based organizations, finding a well-suited partner is unusually valuable. And there as well, what you're doing already is the next point here, you're exercising expectation management. It's unusually valuable to do so because one of the biggest problems I think we run into in community engaged learning is the disappointment that not everything you hoped that would be possible is possible. Students, faculty, and community partners often develop expectations that will not be met. And so simply by starting with really reasonable, practical goals and expectations, you guarantee success, and that is a great way to keep things moving forward. So there as well, you want to appreciate the diversity of impacts in sustainable development, in working with community organizations. The sustainable development happens different across different sectors of our communities, and you can begin to attempt to appreciate the diversity of those impacts by starting by asking yourself and asking your students to address their needs first, to start with the needs of your community partners, whether you're engaging with them directly, communicating with them directly, or simply reading about them and learning about those needs. To focus, if you start by focusing on their needs first, you in many ways guarantee a kind of success and avoid particularly unfortunate kind of failure. So what are those scales of engagement that I mentioned? We don't need to do a project. You don't always have to do projects that produce something for your communities. Certainly that's valuable, but in getting started, in even in first and second year courses, you can develop materials that call on your students to entertain and to consider what the value of the things you're maybe learning in German-speaking cultures could be for your community. And simply by asking those questions, you are engaging with your community already. If you bring in materials that are locally sourced and say translate them into German, you're engaging with your community rather than simply asking those questions in the abstract, and that helps to ground the learning that's happening in your courses. When students themselves are researching the needs of community organizations, they are doing community engaged work, and that's valuable and grounds the learning that's happening in your courses. And then you can scale that up to ask your students to deliver and respond to the needs of community-based organizations in working on sustainable development. And there you'll see an even higher level of grounding of the experience and the learning that's going on in your classroom. I'll talk about that a little bit as well. One of the pieces I focus on in my work on sustainability and in community engaged learning is this concept of closing the loop. So when we're asking our students to look at the needs of community organizations, we ask them to do so in a responsive way. We're not just looking at these sustainable development projects and the areas where they have need for learning, perhaps from German partners, in order to establish that there is a lack, but rather we want to respond to this need. And that responsive, concerned, sensitive, culturally specific attention to community needs really happens best when you ask yourself, how could we really provide these organizations with some valuable knowledge coming from our German-speaking partners And if you're, whether you're just asking that question or actually answering it with some knowledge that your students have gathered from their German-speaking partners, you're closing the loop, as I often say. You're making sure that you began with questions that started in your community. You took those questions to partners abroad. You worked through the process of translating the results of those conversations and that research, and you brought home something that is not merely attractive, but is actually goal-oriented and practical. To do that means asking new questions about the kind of learning that you're doing in your, oftentimes it involves asking new questions about the kind of learning you're doing in your classes. When we ask what we can learn in community engaged learning, we really have to back up and look at this we. Who is the we when we ask what we can learn? Which communities are you trying to address? What does it mean to learn in this context? We're not just learning about attractive ideas and concepts and maybe examples. We're asking, what can we do in our communities? That's the learning that we're targeting. So we may not be able to learn that it would be better if our energy prices were as high as they are, say, in Germany. And we may not be able to learn that a different amount of regulation tolerance is appropriate for the challenges we're facing. We may not be able to learn those things. So it's important to establish that. So what can we learn? What are the aspects of those sustainable development projects that our communities here are going to find actionable? So when we focus on tangible outcomes, we really foreground the culturally informed decisions and practical action steps that are valuable for community organizations. And that's, I think, valuable because sustainable development happens best at that local scale. And yet there's a need for international learning for several reasons, some of which I'll talk about here briefly. But our goal remains to really change the culture of sustainability, because sustainable development really is a culturally informed practice. And I'm going to use a couple slides here. One is from Sabine Engel, who's the director of the project that I've been lucky to be supported by, Climate Smart Municipalities Exchange, which is run through the Institute of the Environment here at the University of Minnesota. I really like this slide in part because it features the Umweltministerin Ursula Hein-Esser, of whom I'm a big fan. She's the Umweltministerin for North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the state that Minnesota has partnered with in a climate smart municipalities exchange. And you see in this slide the dozens and dozens of participants that have taken part in this exchange. And again, also just by having Ministerin Hein-Esser in this photo, you see that we have engagement across several sectors. And I'm very lucky to have this project happening in my state and engaging with my university, because it means I think I've had the best support one could wish for, and I'm truly thankful for that. And here's another slide that shows us the cities that are involved in this exchange, and one more slide that I borrowed from Sabine Engel with a great quote that I'm touching on here, which is that climate change is a people issue. It is primarily a people issue, and you see here we have a clip from the many Zoom meetings that we do together. And the variety of participants that are involved here, from legislators to mayors to directors of e-mobility institutes, to pollution control agency officials, to faculty, to students, and so on. So we have this broad set of actors supporting projects in sustainable development and exchange between Americans and Germans. And nonetheless, even with this level of support, even with this background level of project development and partnership development, I find when I go out to create projects for my students that I still have to begin at that ground level. The vast majority of people that engage with me and my students are partners that partnerships that I've created, because there's never enough. You always will be going out into the community and creating relationships for your students, and that is simply part of community engaged learning. It's very rewarding, and it's very for faculty and for your students. And we can do that thanks to Zoom, both here within our local communities and within local communities in Germany. And universities have a lot to offer with the learning that they do around sustainable development. At the same time, when we leave our university campuses, we really see a different kind of development, and the goals that are set are often much more practical, and require a bit of a change in our own mindset. So in this slide, I just have one example of a partnership that we developed between a program called Bag It Duluth, which was a campaign here in the town that I work in, to remove plastic bags from grocery stores. And my students partnered with a store in Germany that attempted to remove all packaging from the process of buying goods. It's called Unverpackt Siegen, in the town of Siegen, which is one of our partner cities in this exchange. And that exchange was unusually valuable, I think, because our students asked themselves what they were doing in their community, and then looked for the differences and similarities between what they were doing and what their partners were doing in the partner community, and then delivered to those organizations which were struggling to make progress the takeaways, what could be learned from our international partners. A couple other examples: we've worked with CSAs and nonprofits focused on sustainable development, and we did some exchanges between those groups as well. In the background of these community engaged projects, I have been fortunate to be able to work with a variety of organizations in my area, including research institutes and local businesses. And so this slide features some of those, from Metabolon in Germany to the Smokehouse here in Duluth, which is a wonderful restaurant. If you're ever here, please do visit the Smokehouse, and the Lull Furniture Company, which focuses on sustainable furniture design. These organizations are really hungry for engagement. They welcome that email and that call, and then they can provide context to the questions that your students are asking. At the same time, it's important to try and identify what is of value in the organizations that you're engaging with in German-speaking cultures to these organizations, so you can really maintain that relationship. So in this breakout, I tried to provide at least an overview of some of the basic things that are valuable when faculty and instructors are developing community engaged learning projects, and tried to identify, first of all, what are some of the things that are already there typically at institutions. You often find that you have support for civic engagement, and that's really valuable. So I do recommend that folks reach out to their institution to see what kind of civic engagement support is already there. It might come in the form of instructional design. It might come in the form of an international learning cohort. And typically those projects will point you towards rethinking your learning goals that you're setting in the course, and seeing how you can adapt your learning goals so that they really do accommodate the different kind of learning that happens when civic engagement is part of your project. As I noted, partnership development is a big piece here. You can do some of that on your own, but you can also reach out to your institution to see what kind of partnership development is already happening, because the partnerships that last for several years are the ones that you want to have in your project and contribute to and support. There's also certainly software that is valuable to use when engaging with German-speaking partners. And here I just note a couple of them. Flipgrid and Padlet are great places to start. And I also noted to the instructors involved in this breakout that if you're considering doing a research project tied to your community engaged learning project, that can be a way to give yourself support, because your research is a valuable part of your career. And when we do research on the learning projects that we do, we provide our institutions a way of recognizing the value of what we're doing, and that recognition is key. You may find a couple of years down the road in doing this kind of work that your institution didn't recognize the value that you were bringing to your students. And so we want to get ahead of that. And one way to do that is simply to do a research project on your civic engaged learning work. And there is a hungry academic community for this research. So that's a really beneficial path to add to your curriculum development project. So that's about it for this breakout room. Thank you for listening to the video, and please do go on to check out the academic civic engagement portion of this website, as well as the other portions. Thanks for watching.